Good morning, everyone, and welcome to techUK webinar on Women in Digital Ethics and AI Safety as part of our Tech Together campaign and the first of our Decoding Digital Ethics series. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Tess. I'm the Program Manager in Digital Ethics and AI Safety here at techUK, and we are so delighted to be joined by a group of speakers today, who I'll ask them to introduce themselves in more detail shortly, but I'll list them just so you know the perspective we are entering into this conversation with. We have Felicity Birch, Executive Director of the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit. We have Susan Brink, Data and AI Ethics Lead of Kainos Group. We have Elizabeth Seeger, Director of CAMS from Demos Digital Policy Research Hub, and we have Abigail Opong, AI Ethics Researcher at Ghana NLP. You may be thinking, Tess, International Women's Day was March 8th, so why are we having this conversation at nearly the end of the month? And do not get me wrong, I'm all for International Women's Day, but we wanted to extend the conversation outside of that one day, perhaps reflect on the events we have attended throughout this month, and to be frank, I think we deserve more than one day. So here we are. Grateful to be here today for this conversation, which is going to focus on inclusive innovation. Our esteemed panelists will share insights and strategies for success in the tech sector from their own experiences and offer invaluable perspectives on breaking barriers, fostering inclusivity, and enhancing support systems to cultivate a more diverse talent pool to empower women in tech. They will also, alongside all of that, be spotlighting women-led initiatives and be sure to share action steps for you, for the audience, in the form of AI assurance techniques and tools to operationalize AI ethics. So before we jump into the content of the session, of the webinar, just a few housekeeping bits from me. Please be advised that today's session is recorded, so we ask all attendees to keep their camera and mics off. At the conclusion of the webinar, there will be, a dedicated time, about 10 to 15 minutes of a Q&A session, and we encourage you throughout to, drop comments and questions in the Teams chat. Feel free to like the questions that you're most interested in because those that have the highest engagement will be prioritized in the Q&A. And furthermore, we do encourage attendees to share their name and affiliations and research interests in the chat. This will maybe facilitate connections with others who share similar interests. Without further ado, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll turn it over to our panel. I'll begin by asking the panel to briefly introduce themselves and share what inspired them to pursue their career in technology, starting with Elizabeth.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Tess, for the invite. So my name's Elizabeth Seeger. I'm the Director of Digital Policy at Demos, which is a policy think tank in London focusing on putting people at the heart of policy decisions. We really focus on participatory processes and democratizing our policy recommendations. My particular team in digital policy has a strong focus on democratizing technology. Which is about democratizing the use of technology, but also its development and governance decisions as well. So on the question of why I got into tech and what drove me here, I think it's a long story, but I think the main theme here for me was having influential role models in my life that really facilitated my work in technology. Starting quite young at school for me, there were school robotics teams, and the teachers that led the team and some of the parents that were really involved were women who really championed me and made me feel like it was something that I could do and I was good at. And throughout my career in tech, through education, from early days in grade school through undergrad and my PhD, I had some really strong, wonderful women championing me and making me feel confident. And so I think that that's a really important role to have. Also the role of male allies in the room that really champion you as well. My very first one was my brother, who's 3 years older than I am. And like a lot of little siblings, I wanted to do everything that he did. He was very into robotics and technology and cars. And I just followed him around and he made me feel like I could do anything that he could do. And he'd tell people off if they said I couldn't. So I think definitely having those allies in the room too has been really important and transformational for me.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining today. And Abigail.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. My name is Abigail Oflon and I'm from Ghana. I'm part of Ghana NLP and my research is focused on AI ethics. So with my work, I kind of look around the African languages and making sure that the data that we collect, the models that we are training are all kind of fair with respect to gender. And my research is not only focused on languages, I also do health because I'm growing up, I'm always fascinated about health, care system, especially in Africa. So I wanted to know how I can also contribute to that field. And so right now, I'm particularly excited about neurotechnologies, computational neuroscience, how probably over here we can also build these technologies. And in building these technologies too, I'm also part of a conversation where we are trying to make sure that when it comes to clinical trials, it's more inclusive. Because at the end of the day, we have products that is been exported to Africa. So the question I asked is, do we have probably Africans who are also part of the clinical trials so that at the end of the day, we have an equity when it comes to all these validations? Yeah. And with why I'm interested in technology, for me, as I've said already, my interest was to study medicine, be in the healthcare sector and all that. But then when it got to the time where I had to choose attend the university, I had to choose the tech field because I realized that this is the future and I want to also contribute to some of the technologies that we will be building over here in Africa and also contribute to the conversation that's going around here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Abigail. Felicity.
Thank you. Lovely to be here today and lovely to be alongside such great other speakers. So thank you to you and colleagues at techUK for bringing us together. I was sort of reflecting on this question a bit because I ended up in tech by accident, but I certainly stayed here on purpose. I actually started my career as an economist. And working in sister organisations of techUK at what is now Make UK and then the CBI, but moved into innovation policy and quickly became quite obsessed with the possibilities that innovation and technology created for society, for business growth, and for all sorts of things that we could never have done before. But also realized how hard innovating and delivering technology successfully were, and I've become really fascinated by this problem. And I think that that's the problem that's defined my career. And more lately, I was particularly interested in this issue that a lot of companies were sort of approaching me with, that it's like, we have these really fascinating ideas of things that I could do with data, I could do with technology, you know, if I could only link these people's data up, if I could only use this AI tool like this, but actually I'm not sure if it's responsible, I'm not sure if it's legally compliant, so maybe I won't do it. And I thought that that's a really interesting sort of tricky problem, that you want people to use technology responsibly, but you don't want to stop them. You don't want to stop them from using it responsibly. So how do you kind of help people to do that? And that's the kind of really tricky problem that I'm interested in solving, and that we're working on at Responsible Technology Adoption Unit.
Thank you, Felicity. Definitely something our membership is working through. Last but not least, Susan.
Fiddling with the mute button. Hi, yeah, pleasure to be here as well. Thank you for having me. So my name is Suzanne. I'm a data ethicist at Kainos, and we are a digital services provider and a digital transformation partner we basically deliver AI to both the public and the private sector. And I like Felicity. I didn't start off in technology. I landed here a little bit. I think due to my thirst for learning. I love that technology is a constant learning curve, and that's just something that drives me as an individual. But before this, I worked in both psychology and HR. And one of my spaces in HR was actually in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for me, there's a lot of parallels between that space and the space I'm in today. There is, all the way from needing to convince people to look a little bit further than their direct profit bottom line, and recognizing that by investing in responsible practices, you can often bring about greater returns in a little bit in the longer run. Just looking at biases and sort of reviewing systems and processes structurally. And I'm actually surprised that we don't, I find that our community, the AI ethics community, doesn't collaborate necessarily very intensely with diversity, equity, and inclusion groups. But I think that we could do more of that. I think there's a lot of parallels there. But what's interesting for me in terms of my sort of career path is that HR and psychology are both quite female-dominated spaces. They are often, especially in the initial phases of career, you see a lot more women than men. And what you then tend to see at the higher echelons is that there are actually relatively more men. And that in and of itself is really quite striking, and is something that I think sends sometimes quite a difficult message when you're in that space. In technology, it's different, right? We have on average more men. And what I find is, of course, that comes with some challenges, some blind spots, some things we want to address, but also I think with some advantages in terms of focus on female progression. And that's what I see in my organization a lot. So there's a lot of emphasis on progressing women, very strong female network. We have our CEO as one of the key sponsors of our female Inspire network. And that sends actually really powerful messages. So for me, that comparison between sort of this female dominated space and the male space, they both come with, different parameters, but there are some advantages to it as well, from my perspective.
Well, thank you so much, each of you, for introducing yourself and sharing a bit about why you entered and maybe more importantly stayed in the tech sector. Coming from a philosophy background myself, it's always interesting to hear non-technical individuals in the space. First question, Felicity, I was hoping you could jump in and share a bit how we can ensure that technology is developed by diverse teams that reflect the society it serves, and what are the potential consequences of not doing so? Further, in what ways do you think the tech industry benefits from diverse perspectives, particularly those of women?
Fab, thank you, and a great question. And I'm gonna start with a bit of a personal story. So I'm very proud to be from an armed forces family. My dad was a helicopter pilot, and in fact my middle name is named after one of the pioneering female pilots. So like clearly he had an idea in mind for what I might get up to in my future. And when I was a little girl, he took me to look at one of his helicopters. And he's a search and rescue pilot. The helicopters go out for sort of long periods of time. And then he pulls out this tube and he says to me, "What do you think this tube is, Felicity?" And I said, "No idea. No idea. I don't know, Dad." And he says, "This is our toilet." And I just sort of remember 4 or 5 years old thinking, "Oh, that's not really for me then, is it?" And I think that, this is just an example of when something is designed by men, designed for men, designed like in a quite a sort of narrow way. It's not going to work for women. And actually, like it doesn't really matter sort of which group you're talking about, unless you have diverse teams designing things. It's not going to work. And I think one of the things that the disability community talks about in particular is nothing about us without us. And this idea that you really need to involve the people who are affected by design sort of right from the start. And this is partly through building a diverse team yourself, but also, thinking about who are the customers of this product, who are the people that are affected by this product. And it's one of the reasons actually at Responsible Technology Adoption Unit, we do a lot of work around public engagement and trying to understand public attitudes and public values around data and AI use. So we do sort of regular surveys looking at the the macro picture, sort of in general, how do people feel about the use of data and AI? But also when it comes to specific use cases, one of the things that we do, particularly within government, is partner with other government departments and sort of help them think through those issues, engage with public and affected individuals. And I think that this typically leads to much better outcomes for the individuals involved, and make sure that that technology is absolutely designed with them in mind.
Yeah, thanks for pointing to the need for diverse teams to simply consider things that may have been just forgotten or not integrated into design. And for the very visual example as well, kind of running with that practical guidance to attract and retain women in tech. Elizabeth and Abigail, I was hoping you could share some strategies or initiatives that have proven effective in encouraging more women to pursue careers in digital ethics and AI safety. Maybe starting with Elizabeth and then turning to Abigail.
Yeah, so I can say, speaking from my personal experience, at a young age, one of the best things that started getting me involved and interested in these areas was a robotics team initiative that was in the United States. I think has spread internationally, called First Robotics. And there was a really strong push to have a lot of inclusion of women and minorities in these teams, and really to foster this culture and excitement around technology, but not just around the technology itself, but around a culture of cooperation and integration. And so it was a competitive robotics league, but very much had a focus on helping other teams, and really encouraging people to participate. And this was something that ran from a really young age, from little Lego robots through to, in high school, we were building a 120-pound, 5-foot tall aluminum monstrosities. But I think having this and that, really feeling part of that community, and all of the effort that went into this initiative to really focus on inclusion and participation. I remember there were a few teams that were Girl Scout troops that made themselves into robotics teams, and so there was really this culture. So I think and everyone will have a different experience of how they got to where they are, but for me, having the initiatives really early on, to make women feel like they can and like they belong. I guess sort of the, to contrast with what Felicity was saying about having that really early foundational experience of, oh, this isn't for me. I had some really early foundational experiences of, this is for me, but I know that that was an initiative that was well organized, and people were putting a lot of effort into that, and I was very lucky in that respect. Yeah, so I think from my experience, having those foundational experiences and getting people feeling comfortable and included, and like they belong from the beginning.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Abigail.
Yes, thank you. And so for me, I started off going to an all-girls high school. And so over there, it was basically like a community, because we are all girls. And then at the end of the day, we wouldn't have to have the edge to be competing with guys. And so from there, it kind of built like community. And it also gave me an idea of how powerful young girls are. Because I mean, we could go for competitions and then all that, and then sometimes we can get up to the top. And so that also gave us the kind of a sense that women, we can also do things great. And with respect to my career journey, I think for me, when I started with AI ethics, particularly in Africa, I didn't really get more women in the space to look up to. So I was particularly in more international groups as well. And they've been very helpful as well in reaching out to them, because people have time to talk to me, looking at the fact that I had nobody to kind of look up to from the community that I'm coming from. And so that's also kind of give me a sense that one day there's going to be like a community where I am, and I could also relate well to.
It's so funny. I did first robotics as well, and I also had the opportunity to go to all girls school, all sisters. So I think, being in these female-led environments does give a bit of space and encouragement as well. Shifting to kind of application of emerging technologies to enhance functions like hiring. Felicity, I know you just yesterday, the RTA released guidance for AI in recruiting and hiring, and Susan comes from a background in HR tech. So I would love for you to share with myself and the audience how we can consider and mitigate potential bias and ethical dilemmas that could arise through these applications, and ensure accountability in their use. Maybe starting with Felicity, and then we can shift to Susan.
Yeah, really, really happy to say a little bit more about that, and thank you for plugging the guidance, which we did indeed publish yesterday. And I think it's a really good example of the way we work and the kind of work that we're trying to do, because I think there are lots of opportunities from AI-enabled tools in HR and recruitment to actually improve diversity and inclusion, from improving the candidate experience through to like helping people source more diverse lists of potential candidates for roles. But they also pose some really novel risks, in particular sort of perpetuating bias, perpetuating exclusion, discriminatory job advertising. And this is something that I've sort of felt really, really personally as well. I've seen some of the documentaries about this. So I have ADHD, and one of the things I really struggle with is eye contact. And I'd seen people talking about their experience using some of these AI-driven tools with ADHD and autism, who just couldn't get through because they weren't sort of focusing on the screen in the same way that a neurotypical person might. So I think that there are some really, I do think there's lots of opportunities, but some really big potential risks as well. So that's why our team produced guidance, why we've updated guidance, which is very much looking to help organizations who are looking to procure, deploy AI systems, and sort of make sure you're kind of continually monitoring those processes. It focuses on assurance, good practice, but we've also brought in the ICO, the HRC, so the regulators on data and equality, to make sure that we're giving you the guidance that does align with the sort of regulatory expectations. But as well as that, we engaged with civil society groups like Autistica, which is an autism research and campaigning charity, who are sort of specifically interested in making sure that autistic voices are heard, to make sure that the guidance is not only really relevant for businesses and you all sort of adopting technology, but it also reflects the needs of the people who the technology is going to affect as well. So we definitely encourage your members to take a look at that, particularly if you're using AI and data-driven tech in those contexts around HR and recruitment.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Felicity. And Susan.
Yeah, just to add to that, I read the guide which came out yesterday, and it's great, so absolutely have a look. And I'll try to add some tips that are not already in there. It's actually very comprehensive and covers a lot of territory, which, coming from this space, I can say I think they're all really good tips. Maybe just a few to add to that guide. Saw somebody just put the link in the chat, so have a look there. It's implicit in the guide actually, but I'm going to make it more explicit, and that is, I would not necessarily recommend you try to build your own HR tech unless you are sort of a dedicated technology or organization, a provider of your own accord. Do purchase this technology, because there's so much that you need to take into account. Like Felicity was saying, a lot of potential pitfalls. You need wide, varied data to build this kind of technology in a sensible way. You need lots of checks, lots of monitoring, and it kind of essentially takes a little army to get it right. And I think you more quickly have the right resources for that through a provider than trying to build it in-house. So that is one tip. The other piece is that I think what's often overlooked is that, especially if you bring AI into your selection process and you leverage it as a piece of your assessment, you can actually ask pretty similar questions of providers as you would of traditional assessment providers. And I think people often don't necessarily appreciate that. So for example, if a provider is claiming to assess cognitive ability, you can ask them around construct validity. So, okay, what evidence do you have to show that you're actually assessing cognitive ability and not something else? Where, for example, having correlations with other traditional cognitive ability tests to show that, you know, your scores are really getting at that thing you're saying you're getting at. Or correlations with performance, which is predicted validity, or if you tested at one point in time and again a little bit down the line, what is the correlation there, which is called test-pretest reliability. So these are all well-established metrics in traditional assessment that you can ask of your AI assessment providers as well. And the good providers will have this information ready for you. Will be able to evidence that, you know, they have scientific validity behind their tools. And then a last tip would be when leveraging it in a kind of throughout your recruitment cycle, I think it's really helpful to think about these tools as an additional panelist. So we know that in traditional recruitment, it's useful to have multiple panelists in an interview setting, for example. You don't want to have just one person assess ideally. And AI you could see as an additional panelist with different strengths and weaknesses from humans. So I think a strength being that we know that humans are notoriously inconsistent. So they will, they'll get tired, or they'll see someone who's a lot like them and suddenly like them more. And AI won't do that. It will be consistently judging people on the same criteria and not get tired throughout. And that's a strength compared to humans. But a weakness, for example, is that AI will be typically less good at contextualizing. So if a human's, you would be able to judge if somebody has made amazing career progression whilst being on maternity leave for a year in that same period compared to another candidate who didn't have that break in between. You'd be able to appreciate that, and AI doesn't necessarily have that kind of nuance built in, depending on how it's built, of course. So humans have flaws, AI has flaws, and by partnering but recognizing the relative strengths, I think, and then considering it as an additional panel member, you can actually bring some real strengths to your recruitment process and read the guide.
Thank you both so much. I think I would also just, make that even broader in the sense of technology, yes, in recruiting, but in general as a augmentation with its strength and its weaknesses that must be considered and mitigated for. I would love, Elizabeth and Susan, for you to jump in and share a bit about role models and mentorship. There are so many individuals that I can, earlier on in my career, just reflect on their guidance and shaping who I have become and will become. And I was hoping you could share some experiences or insights on how another woman in technology has influenced your approach to digital ethics and decision making, and maybe some of their initiatives or projects, action steps that you find particularly helpful or inspiring or impactful. We'll start with Elizabeth and then shift to Susan.
Yes, it's a good question. Let's see. So thinking back, like one of the earliest and most impactful female role models I had in tech was actually the mother of a good friend who was on the robotics team with me. But she had gone to Caltech and gotten her PhD in material science when women didn't go to Caltech or get PhDs in material science. And she was just a really strong champion for me throughout high school and even through undergrad. And anytime I was sort of hitting a wall and feel like I didn't belong, or why aren't these men listening to me, she was just sort of there to say, like, no, you can do this, and giving me pointers on she gave me a lesson on how to speak guy, she said one day. But just having her there as this person who had done it and was in the space was just that was huge for me and really influential. And I know a lot of the career decisions I've made have often been moving towards spaces, organizations where there have been women that I've seen that are in leadership roles that I'm inspired by, and who I feel like I want to emulate that person. And so having that representation and those role models for me has been a really important factor. And in fact, where I am at Demos right now, our CEO, Polly Curtis, is, she's amazing. And part of the reason the organization as a whole is amazing. But part of the reason I took the job was because my interactions with her during the interviews, I felt like this is a person I want to emulate. She's smart, she's competent, but also encouraging and warm. And you just don't get that combination in a lot of people. So again, everyone's journey to where they are is a little bit different. But for me, having human connections and role models and people to emulate has been really important. But I'd be interested in hearing other people's experiences as well.
So I'll go next, and I'll cheat a little bit and tell you about a story which wasn't actually a tech leader, but it was an important influence in my career. So in one of my early days, one of my first roles, we were reviewing competencies of like you had to sort of self-assess, and you would say whether on certain skills you were at knowledge, ability, or skill or ability or mastery, different levels. And I remember my boss at the time saying, okay, you have this competency at skill. And I counted her a little bit. I said, like, yeah, these and these components, yes, I can evidence that. I'm not so sure if I have enough experience. And she looked at me and she said, Suzanne, do you think a man will be telling me this? and it really like stuck with me in a moment to sort of wonder, okay, am I unnecessarily bringing myself down here? And this lady, she went on to be a CHRO in a very large organization. Still today, when I have important sort of career questions or things to consider, I reach out to her, and she sort of consults with me, which is incredibly valuable to have. I think having those kinds of people who will be a bit of a balancing voice and the support is really, really important. In my organization directly in tech, we're really lucky in Kainos in that sense. I think we have a female CTO who's amazing. We have a female head of the data and AI practice who brought me in. And it's in the little things that she does, like occasionally just reaching out to other mothers. I'm a mother of a 2-year-old, and saying, look, you ladies are amazing for like surviving this on a day-to-day basis. And you're losing your test. And challenging diversity in the room and so forth. I find the little things go very far, actually, and having those female role models is very important.
Yes, sorry, I went a bit dark here. I guess I wasn't moving enough, but we're back. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing so far. And as I ask questions too and direct it to individuals, do feel free to jump in. I would love to talk a bit about, as we're discussing people that influence and inspire and allow allyship and partnership as well. And so I'd be curious, in your opinion, what roles allies should play in advocating for gender-inclusive digital ethics practices and supporting the advancement of femfolk in tech, and how might organizations create environments that empower women to raise concerns about ethical dilemmas they're confronted with, maybe in the development of products or services, and without fear of backlash. So Elizabeth and Abigail, if you want to jump in on this one, and welcome all opinions.
So yeah, I can. For me, I think it's most about providing that space and a supportive atmosphere, a place where you feel safe and comfortable being able to express your opinions, and having individuals and a community around you where you feel supported in expressing those things. Yeah, I think from my personal experience, that's the big aspect.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes. So for me, I think I would love to share some personal experience. And so in one of my projects, I was in a project I was the only female in the team. And one day I brought up the idea that we should get like more female in the team. And then there was the comment from the other male ally that we shouldn't just be looking for females to join the team. We should look for people who are competent. And so that kind of gave me an idea that, okay, this is what the society has probably placed in their mind. That's probably we don't have women out there enough to kind of do the work that we are doing. And so I see two things. First of all, trying to help them understand that there are women out there who are actually doing this, and also help them understand that having women around kind of creates a diverse team and diverse perspective as well. And so for me, I think when it comes to the male allies, probably having them joining us in the conversation is always key, because it makes them understand the reason why this should be the main thing in getting more women on board.
Perfect. Thank you, Abigail. It actually just made me think too, and I've sent this in the chat for attendees. There's a list of over 100 billion women in AI ethics that's released each year. Of course, lists can't account for everyone, but they're a great place to start for people that are looking for speakers or other individuals to engage with. This will be my final question to the panel, and I'm saying that because we have dedicated time for questions from the audience. So if you can, or if you haven't already, type your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to field them to the panelists shortly. So my final question is really focused on next steps. So how do we take it back to organizations? What is your key message? Thank you so much for sharing your time so far, but what can we do to make sure voices are heard in the rooms which attendees occupy? We'll start with Susan, and then we'll go to Elizabeth, and then we'll go to Abigail, and then we'll go to Felicity. Susan?
Yeah,
Perfect.
next steps.
Thank you.
Next steps. If only there was a silver bullet, right? I think it's a lot of things that help to bring this space forward. I would say what's common to both delivering responsible AI and progressing women in the workplace is to address your blind spots and recognize that you have them as a human. And I would say that goes actually both for men and women, like with the example I just gave, that was a blind spot of mine, right? So I think there's making the time for collecting data and input and building in feedback loops to gather input from different groups. Diverse teams are critical, but I don't necessarily think they're always enough, because there's so many different ways in which diversity can express itself. There's intersectionality to consider as well, and it's unrealistic to think that your AI development team is going to represent all the different flavors of all diversities we want to take into account. And I think that's where, like Felicity was mentioning earlier, those feedback loops, building in diverse input in your impact assessments, in having widespread user research, those are the kind of mechanisms that are really important for responsible tech. And from a sort of more building inclusive workplaces perspective, I think one of the things I learned from being in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I was an ally and LGBTQ plus focal point in my role. And I remember feeling really insecure a lot of the time about sort of, am I doing it right? Am I considering everything well enough? And I think just by asking lots of questions, but also learning to be a bit forgiving about, hey, it's okay to learn over time and to make some mistakes, but then as long as you invite feedback, you can improve over time. I think that's a really important mindset, because we can sometimes get a little bit perfectionistic about inclusion, and that doesn't always help real progress, I don't think.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Okay, I was thinking I wanted to layer on top of this idea around participation and like having the feedback loops in place for thinking about the impacts of the technology and the user base. So I think like having participatory processes and those feedback loops is really important, but also expanding beyond the user base of the technology, not just thinking about who's going to be the direct user of the technology, but who's that technology impacting more widely. And so that could be the direct users of the technology, but we could also be thinking about knock-on impacts like the environmental impacts. There's a lot of discussion around the energy uses for training these models and potential downstream environmental impacts, and who's that going to be impacting primarily and first. But also we can think about data labeling, who's the workforce behind making these AI technologies actually viable. And so when we think about AI impact, not just thinking about who's benefiting from the technology and who's using it, and bias and discrimination that might come into play at the point of use, but bias and discrimination throughout that entire value chain, leading through AI development, through its use, and the downstream knock-on impacts. And so having more public participation processes in decision making, not just in AI design, but in the governance of AI, high impact decision making about how funds are being distributed, about how models are being shared, about, you know, to what extent the country is going to invest in more compute infrastructure, things like this. I feel like it's really important to have more participatory citizen involvement in some of these high stakes decision making. And yeah, so I wanted to throw in a bid for expanding the bubble of what we're thinking about in terms of AI impacts.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Abigail.
Yes, I think a lot have been said, and so probably to add up, I would say we should look at it in the way of seeing it as a norm in the organization or company that we find ourselves in. Because for me, when I first of all joined Ghana NLP, there were this kind of only male developers, and so they weren't kind of focusing on the research that I'm focusing on now, that's detecting gender bias in some of the machine translations. And so as a woman, after testing the system, I saw that no, it's kind of not built towards both men and female. And so that's why I took it upon myself to work on it. And I was thinking, or I just suggested to them that if they had probably a more or an equal both more male and then female, probably they could have detected this issue at first. And so for me, I think having both male and female at the beginning, probably in the process of developing the technology, is also key. Just to add up.
Thank you, Abigail. And Felicity.
Thanks. And a difficult question to go last on, because I found myself really agreeing with a lot of comments of the previous speakers. But I think one thing that sort of often reflected in this space is that there's often a lot of attempt when you're like, oh, we need to like make sure we're hearing more from the women. So let's give them some confidence classes and some speak up classes. And Elizabeth was talking about like, how do you speak guy? And, you know, like, sometimes being realistic, doing those things is helpful, but ideally we shouldn't be fixing the women, we should be fixing the organizations. And I think that that's a really important point. And for me, you know, we talk a lot about culture, but actually, like, do your processes support women's involvement? Do they support the involvement of diverse voices? And I think, you know, a lot of what Elizabeth was saying about like the stages at which you might want to think about these groups and affected individuals, do your processes build that in? I think that's a really important question. You know, when you are thinking about how to use the tech, when you're designing the tech, when you're developing the tech, when you're deploying the tech, and when you're using it, do you at each of those moments have a chance to kind of hear back from people who are affected and involved, and not just hear from them, but actually then take action on it? And I think that that's sort of where I would challenge people to think about this. If you really want diverse voices to be included in the way that tech is developed and used, you have to find ways to hear from those voices actively and build it into your process.
Thank you so much all for your additions. We've got a few incredible audience questions, which I'll start to share now. Starting with Adeline Warner. She is particularly interested in the role of diversity and ethics in innovation, AI, and digital service design. It would be great to hear a bit more about how you guys are working with digital service design and making sure that it includes ethical principles.
I can take that at least a bit. So at Kainos, our user research, user designer group is very large and very critical to how we do our work. So I don't think we really ever deploy AI without having at least some of them in on the project group. And I find in practice they're sort of my closest ally. in the ethics space. So give a very concrete example, we'll run impact assessments, and we do that in a sort of workshop setting. We conduct harms workshops and then figure out who could be impacted here in this setting, and what could be the impact be, positive and negative. And then having the lens of the user researchers who've already been taking Elizabeth's points, you'd want to look wider than just your direct users, right? And typically they would map it out more widely as well. But bringing in their direct input. And of course, depending on the system and the resources available, you'd want to ideally even bring the impacted parties directly into those sessions. But the user researchers are really critical sort of allies for me to get the ethics voice embedded into what we do, because through those workshops, we then figure out the kind of mitigations we want to bring into the setting, into the rest of our design, and again, build that into how we then build the AI solutions. We also have a couple of user designers and researchers who are explicitly looking into ethics from their angle and doing capability building among the group. So there's a real, I think, a natural kind of connection there, because this group will care about human impact, right? And that's of course what ethics cares about too. So I find there's a lot of synergies, and we collaborate a lot.
And maybe
Thank
I
you,
can.
Susan.
Oh,
Yes,
sorry,
please,
Tess. I was
Phyllis.
gonna say, maybe
No,
I can come in
please.
on this one. And hi to Otto. We were at university together, so it's nice to hear
Oh,
from
lovely.
you on this call. Won't say how long ago that was. But I just thought, actually, I talked about you need to build in your processes, and that's one of the things that we've been thinking about from a government perspective. And I particularly wanted to talk about what we're doing on transparency. So my team, Responsible Tech Adoption Unit, and the Cabinet Office work together to develop the algorithmic transparency recording standard. A bit of a mouthful, but a really important tool for government to explain how it's using technology. And we built this in a way that was really sort of user focused throughout. Firstly, the fact is that we want to be more transparent about how we're using algorithms, but like what does transparency mean in practice? We did some surveys, and people sort of said that they wanted us to share all of the information about algorithms. So we mocked up what that might look like, took that out to some focus groups, and actually quite quickly realized that sharing all of the information is not meaningful transparency for most people. That's not helpful transparency at all. So we developed the standard into sort of two-tier model. The first tier has fairly basic information about the tool. The second is one that perhaps civil society groups or journalists might want to dig into in a little bit more detail. But we also worked with the public sector teams who are going to have to fill this in to sort of understand, is this the kind of information actually that you could fill in, that you could share? And we've continued to sort of develop and iterate that tool. So I think a lot of innovation methodologies that we're used to using in other spaces like youth-focused design and agile design are actually really helpful to building in diverse voices. But I think this is a really nice example because we now have this standard. It is a recognised standard for the public sector. We're working on mandating it in the public sector, but it's also something that industry can use if you're thinking about using algorithms and communicating the way that you're doing that with your use base, with your customers, or your kind of wider stakeholder network as well.
Thank you, Felicity and Susan. Kind of keeping the practical guidance going. A question from Charlotte Russell Parson, asking if there are any existing ethical frameworks or checklists to help use of generative AI safely. She's specifically looking for application and communications, but if there are any kind of frameworks that she can reference for guidance.
So I'm not specifically aware. Oh, Suzanne, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I'm not specifically aware on communications tools with generative AI, and I think one of the issues, of course, with writing frameworks is these tools and their impacts are all extremely context dependent. But I would really encourage you to make sure that you are looking at the guidance that's been put out by the regulators in your space and making sure that your use is compliant with the regulations in the first instance, but then sort of thinking about your internal governance mechanisms as well.
I would maybe just agree with all that, and although it's not necessarily chatbot specific, there is quite a good guide that was brought out recently by the government actually for generative AI development, sort of directed at the government, but very applicable to private sector too. It walks through all the kind of considerations you want to have when you're considering generative AI, all the way from is this the right tool for this particular problem to how would you deploy it and monitor it and so forth. There is some guidance open source available from Microsoft around chatbots, but it was developed pre-generative AI wave. So it's sort of if you combine those two, I think that's an interesting starting point for some practical guidance.
Oh, we've just had the generative AI framework sent in the group chat for reference for those that are curious. Perfect. Abigail, any additions, or should I share the next question?
Yeah, I think probably Susan and Felicity have said it all, and I'm glad the guideline was said in the chats as well.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, moving on to a specific question around HR products for recruitment from Anissa Asatrina, who is developing an HR product. She's curious what the most important factors to consider when developing and designing these product features of this nature to make sure that it is ethical by design.
I don't want to be the only one talking all the time. I mean, for one, so very briefly for me, then I really, I'm not just paying lip service here. I do think the guide that came out yesterday from around recruitment is a really nice way to structurally think through what an AI product is recruitment, of course. So when we say HR products, this could be quite a few different things. So I think the exact answer will depend on what you're looking at exactly. But certainly in the HR space, I would say that kind of some of the key considerations that typically pop up are around bias and transparency. Bias because you want to make sure you have an equal process for all and everyone has equal chances in the workplace to have access to resources and progress and so forth. And transparency because you do often want to be able to explain what you're doing to people in an HR context. This is people's life, it's their jobs. When the tool fits into any kind of decision making, you need to understand how it's influencing your decision making, because even if it's just an assistive tool, it's still going to potentially bias your decision. So you want to understand where it's coming from, but also you need to be able to explain it to people when you're, for example, not giving them certain opportunities that they'll want to be able to, be able to ask why, and you need to have an answer. So I would say bias and transparency, some of the key factors. And then, yeah, there's lots of depth you could go into either of those dimensions, which could take us all day. So I may stop it there and see if anyone else has anything else to add.
Well, I'm just going to have to let you go first if you're going to plug our guidance as the first step. But I think just to build on that, but also kind of take a step back slightly. I think it's quite important to remember that like most businesses do know how to do governance and do govern other risks in your business, and AI does present some new and novel risks. It does escalate and accelerate some risks, but most businesses do have tools for governing those risks, and you should be thinking about AI, like building AI governance into your other governance structures, and thinking about all of those things like bias, transparency, accountability, safety, and security. So as part of that conversation, I think one place actually where the guidance is particularly useful though is in helping you sort of think about the right questions to ask and being an intelligent customer, and really making sure that you are challenging the way that the tools are used, like whether they work, and making sure that you sort of satisfied yourself that the answers that you're getting from your providers and indeed from your internal teams like do meet your kind of company's wider values and your risk appetite as a business.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Final question from the audience from Chris Middleton, asking from your personal experience and then in more general terms, how might individuals, whether a parent or uh, uh, a companion, make sure to encourage or discourage oh, sorry. Let me rephrase. How can a parent or an individual who's guiding someone's pursuit in career encourage them to pursue science and technology and kind of shape that early on initiatives that make women feel welcome in these spaces? The big question.
It is a big question. And, I got some good advice when I was applying to university that I should apply for things that I enjoy and I'm really interested in and that are going to promote like me asking questions and learning and enjoying that. And it has actually always really been the driving and guiding factor for what I've done. But I would also note that my last 3 job titles did not exist when I left university. And, strong advocate for developing science and technology skills. There's lots of support available. Do check out the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology's website for more information on those. But actually the really important thing is that you're curious, that you're asking questions. Because the sort of world of work is going to change quite a lot. And I had a tech member at CBI, sorry, competitor, but used to talk about the fact that like kids now are going to need to become like masters of the midlife crisis. They're going to need to reinvent themselves multiple times. Careers will change, technology will force some of that happening. So I really think, being excited, being curious about technology, but also thinking about some of those wider questions on resilience as well.
Yeah, I
Perfect.
had a similar experience where growing up, my stepdad, he would tell me, he says, he's all these questions you're getting at school about what do you want to be when you grow up, and he says, chances are your job hasn't been invented yet. That's what he would say. He's like, no, it just hasn't even been invented yet, which is so
Yeah.
true. I think my job didn't exist even like 10 years ago. And so, yeah, I think your point around, encourage learning and curiosity is so important. Yeah.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for all of your additions and for everyone that tuned in, for your attention, your time. I'm sad to say our time has come to a close, but thank you so much to the panelists for this incredible conversation. As we conclude, I'd like to note that this webinar marks the inauguration of Decoding Digital Ethics will be a series monthly, so do stay tuned for forthcoming discussions on dis and misinformation in elections and the role of AI as an ESG issue and much more. So for those interested in diving deeper, do get in contact. Thank you so much again.